Today is January 27th, 2022. My name is Cameron Wood. I'm here with Randy Cordell at the Ohio History Connection in Columbus, Ohio, and we're going to talk today about his mother, Barb Cordell, and her work at the Pater Noster House. Randy, can you please say and spell your name for me?
Yes, it's Randy Cordell. It's RandyCordle.
Thank you. Tell us a little about yourself.
Well, I was born in 1966 and grew up on the west side of Columbus, far west side of Columbus. I subsequently went to Ohio State University and then to the University of Cincinnati for medical school. And I've been a practicing physician since 1992.
So, your mother's Barb Cordell. Where was she born?
She was born in Akron, Ohio on October 1st, 1939.
We want to learn today how Pater Noster came to exist and why your mother, Barb Cordell, chose this as her vocation.
Sure. So it's interesting that I have the benefit of an interview that she did back in 2000 where she was asked this question. And her answer was simply this. She said it all started with a simple Our Father. And of course, the interview just went on and didn't really inquire much about what she meant. I actually, being her son, have spoken to her about this many times, and we've discussed the Pater Noster, Our Father, too many times to count, because it was the prayer that guided her life and guided everything. So when she said that in the interview, we can get into the details of the timing and things like that. But I just wanted to first, I think anything talking about my mom's life should start with the Our Father, because that's what she did every single day. So the words of the Our Father are, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation and deliver us from evil. And real quickly, I just want to kind of go through that. And then throughout the rest of our talk, you're going to see how her life was modeled around this prayer. But the Our Father, or the Pater Noster, which is just Latin for Our Father, started when the apostles asked Jesus, how should we pray to God? And Jesus made them understand that, one, you should understand that God is Abba, or the loving Father, like the one who provides love, forgiveness, and that, which was all about the New Testament, was about love. But then he taught them that prayer. It's actually in two different books of the Bible, and is commonly referred to as the way to start prayer in most Christian faiths, at least. If you look at the Our Father, I'm going to point out a couple of the important points that she made when we would talk about this. It starts out as Our Father. It's important because it's not my father, it's our Father. And everything that my mom, Barb, did was about community, about family, about putting everyone in the same pot, no matter how rich they were, poor they were, their intelligence, whatever it was, it didn't matter. It was one body of Christ. Even for non-believers, they were still part of the body of Christ in her view. And it was about our Father. Then the next part is the invocation, of course, and it continues the invocation, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And this is the part that's basically saying, it's sacred. You're worthy of our worship. And of course, she would believe that. If you carry on to the next part of and I'm being very cursory, and there's a lot more I could say, but I'm just trying to make some major points here. The next part, so Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. What my mom would point out about this is that this is about creating heaven on earth, and that we should all aspire to do that for everyone, from the poorest, those in need, to the richest. All should be thinking, how do we create heaven on earth? And also in this society we have, which is all about me right now, she would point out that everything is about thy will be done. And so it's about the theology of life, not the meology of life. And she lived her life, and in fact, at one point in a written scroll in her prayer book, literally said, I give my life to you. I'm no longer Barb Cordell. I'm yours. Use me, essentially. And I think you can't say that any better. That's theology. That's not meology. If you carry on through the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then it says, give us this day our daily bread. And that is about substance, but it's important to think that it's not about bread or the next pizza pie you get. It's about the substance to do God's will. Whatever it takes for me to do your will is what Barb would ask for. And I'm going to point out as we go through a few of the many, many examples where at the last minute substance was given. Shockingly, I mean, I still to this day can't believe all the examples of this that happened in her mission and her evangelization with Pater Noster and the job list and just life. It was incredible how often this happened. If you then go on, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's important, and she would point out that this is in some ways a contract you're making. You're basically asking this all-inspiring, all-loving, completely forgiving Father to forgive you to the extent that you're forgiving others. Now, that's a pretty hard contract. That's a big bet there, right? But you need to aspire to try to forgive others. And in many occasions in my mom's life, she would forgive people instantly that many of us would have a hard time ever forgiving for, even the slightest little thing. But for her, some big things like being run over by a truck, for example, and instantly forgiven. A physician who made a life-threatening mistake, and as a physician, I understand this, who before she would let them help her, she wanted to make sure he knew that it was okay. And it's just kind of astounding. It wouldn't have been my first thought, to be honest. Carrying on then with the prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And then it says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And there's a lot that could be said about this, but the point that I wanted to make that she would make is she read this to mean, do God's will and don't worry about it. She took Deuteronomy 31:8, I believe it is, very seriously, which paraphrased says, if God directs you there, he'll lead you, he'll be with you, he won't leave you, he won't forsake you. And then it goes on, the part that most people know. It says, be not afraid and be not discouraged. So no matter what happened in her journey forward, through everything that she did, through Pater Noster, and even through the moment of her death, she never had fear as long as it was what God wanted. And I'll give a number of examples of those later where it sometimes was, you thought she was crazy, but she just had no fear because she didn't fear death, and she certainly didn't fear evil. She respected it, but she didn't fear it.
So when did this Our Father occur?
Well, to be honest, up until recently after her death, I wasn't 100% sure of which simple Our Father she meant, because she literally said the Our Father multiple times a day. But then after her death, I came into possession of the prayer book that she carried with her for 40 years. And in the prayer book, it literally showed this Our Father and had it dated, the one that changed her life. So I'll tell a couple stories here, but that occurred basically in June of 1980. And that's important because it was shortly after she was released from the hospital from almost dying from an ectopic pregnancy, which I'll come back to in just a moment if that's okay. But if you look at that time period in her life, I was a child, and my mom's vocation at that point, she wasn't a licensed practical nurse, but she was not working in that field all that much right then. She was actually babysitting. And she was babysitting not just a couple kids, but usually something like 12 or 13 children. Almost always, at least some of these children had special health care needs, various syndromes, ventilators occasionally, kids who were in wheelchairs, often kids with special needs that no one else would dare take on. My mom would lovingly open the door, and way before it was mainstream, she would have those children playing with kids who were fortunate not to have any special health care needs. And amazingly, the kids never saw this special health care. They never saw the difference. They just played. They just got along. They loved each other. It was a beautiful thing to see, even when I look back to when I was a teenager seeing this. Interestingly, from that period, she was taking those children daily to mass. Like, all get in the car. This was before the day of car seats and even seatbelts being mainstream, I guess. But they would all go to mass. And in fact, they would sit through the mass. And there are a number of anecdotal and humorous stories that go along with that. But it was interesting that some of the parents would say, how do you possibly do this? I can't go to church on Sunday because my child misbehaves. And they would sneak in the back of the church and just watch the way that this actually worked and find it instructive that the children would go. And I'm not saying they didn't wiggle, but they were angels in church every day. In addition to this, those same kids, many of them remained like friends with her, even to her dying day. She would get letters, Christmas cards, phone calls, etc., from them. So that was part of her life, even before the 1980 period. The other thing was she was a mom for me and my brother. She was the pancake lady in the neighborhood. All the boys and the occasional brave girl in the neighborhood would come over in the mornings for pancakes. She had a unique way of parenting. One time, and I take this back to just keep thinking, how does this apply in the prayer we said at the beginning? When at one point we boys decided we would rather play Atari, which is the old video games, and skip school, instead of coming over yelling and screaming, grounding and all that, she showed up at the door with bags full of White Castle hamburgers. And we were like, oh no. And so she comes in, she gives us the hamburgers and said, enjoy your day. All of us will be meeting with the parents later tonight and we'll figure out what'll happen then. But there was no anger. It was more of a, I understand, but there will be consequences. But right now, here's your hamburgers. Have a good rest of the day. Stay out of trouble. And I just thought even then, that's a really unique way of dealing with this problem. Not the way most of us probably would have dealt with it. So following on to this, so she's kind of the normal housewife. She's, taking care of kids in the neighborhood and engaged. She's in the PTA. She teaches classes at the school. She's doing all this babysitting and going to church regularly. From there, it kind of started to just slowly branch out. She basically was searching for where is my mission? How am I going to move forward? How am I going to find God's calling? And then she had an event where she, at a more advanced age, got pregnant. And she had been pregnant many times before. Unfortunately, she had a number of miscarriages besides the births of my brother and I. And she went to the hospital and literally told the physician, I'm pregnant. And I think I have an ectopic pregnancy. Like, literally said that. She tells the story because she knew something was wrong. And the physician was in training. And back in that day, you didn't have instantaneous access to lab results like we do now, where in 2 minutes, I can tell if you're pregnant before your body knows it generally. I mean, it's like so much better testing. So he basically explained to her that he thought she was overweight and pulled a ligament and she was fine to go home. She did so, and then about a day and a half, 2 days later, went back emergently to the hospital with internal hemorrhaging and external bleeding from what was clearly an ectopic pregnancy at this point. And this really changed her life in the following way. First, one of the first things she did was called the physician who was involved to her room before they even took her to surgery, is my understanding, to tell him it's okay, because she was terrified that if she died, that he might not forgive himself. And she wanted to let him know it's all good, whatever happens. And then she met with a wonderful Catholic priest who used to work at Mount Carmel, Monsignor Applegate. I believe it's Thomas Applegate, if I remember correctly, who remember, she's got hemorrhaging, she's, sick and has a potentially fatal thing, but she wanted to talk with him because she was concerned about what if she didn't have the surgery? Is there any chance that the baby and the fallopian tube would survive? And if so, shouldn't she just let herself die so that the baby would be saved? And of course, medically, that's crazy, to be honest. And she's a nurse and she kind of knew that, but she wanted to be sure. So Monsignor Applegate and the doctors talked to her and explained that no matter what you do, this baby's not going to make it. So she went forward with the surgery. But it's interesting that even at that moment, her major concern wasn't herself, it was this unborn child. And that is just so consistent with everything else in her life. It didn't surprise me at all when I learned this fact. So that relationship with Monsignor Applegate blossomed. They became very good friends. They shared spiritually many things, wrote letters back and forth for years until he had passed away. But it really just reinvigorated her need to find what is God's mission for me on this earth. I'm doing the mom thing. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I love that. She loved kids in all shapes, sizes, and things. But she just felt like there's something else. And later, when I talk about her youth, you'll understand why she would have felt that way. So he said, continue to go to church and things. So she went back to St. Cecilia's, which is our home parish out on Norton Road. And at that point, the pastor was Monsignor Thomas Bender, who was a fantastic priest, wonderful pastor. And they also developed a very close relationship. I can remember Father Bender being at the house for lunch sometimes or dinner, and she got more and more engaged in the church and talking with him. And he kept telling her, pray, continue coming to church. God will show you the way. Relax. It will come to you. You'll know. Just keep praying and honestly praying. And then a couple funny things happened that I should, if I could, take a brief segue to tell you. So one, I told you about these children who are going to church with her every day. Well, one of the masses Father Bender was giving, in a Catholic mass, they pass around a plate, and in many Christian faiths, to do a collection. Well, one of the children who happened to have trisomy 21 that she was taking care of, a wonderful, wonderful young boy named Kevin, was there, and he didn't quite understand the principle. So when the collection plate came in, he thought, wow, money? I'll take some, and started to take a little bit out of the plate. And Father Bender and most of the people at the mass laughed hysterically and then explained to him how it was supposed to work. The other funny anecdote that happened like this that I can recall from that period was she desperately wanted to find her niche. And at one point at St. Cecilia's, we didn't have enough musical ministers. Now, my mom had just started taking guitar lessons, like literally 2 weeks before. I think she may have known 3 chords, kind of. And so she instantly volunteered to play. And Father Bender, not knowing that she had just started a week before, said, oh, that's so wonderful, Barb. Yeah, definitely. Why don't you do that? So the next Mass did not go exactly as planned. The music was not great. And afterwards, Father Bender approached her, and in his loving way said, Barb, God gives us all gifts. All of us have special gifts. Yours is not music. And suggested that maybe in the future there were other things that would be her path. So what happened after that, though, is she continued to build these relationships. And this was in about 1980 and 81. She then, with Father Bender's support, became a discalced Carmelite nun, which also was a turning point in her life. She wore the scapular and lived the life and the resolutions of a Carmelite nun from that point forward until after her death. And in this process, her faith kept growing and growing and growing. And then one day in church, as it always happens, I understand, she was praying and saw an older gentleman crying and praying in the church, who she kind of knew a little bit, but they weren't like great friends. And so she approached him, felt God saying, what are you sitting here for? You see him crying, you see he's hurting, go do something. So she did. And it was a gentleman named Fred who had lost his job that he had had for essentially a career. He was, if I remember correctly, he was probably in his 60s and still working. And I should tell you, you have to remember the time period. We're talking 80, 81. We're in the middle of, horrid conditions in the job market. There was like 20, 25% unemployment. And this is unemployment where people are trying to get jobs to feed their family and they can't get jobs. Not like sometimes the fake numbers of choosing not to work. These were, you want a job, there's no jobs right now. And what he was crying about is that he'd had this long-term job and he'd lost it. And there were no jobs, especially no jobs that wanted to hire an older gentleman who's approaching the end of his career time. And my mom, for some reason, has no experience in this, but says, well, I'm going to help him find a job. So she went home and started calling 9 or 10 places that seemed like they had jobs similar to his. And lo and behold, found a gentleman who said, and this is one of those examples, how did you know to call me? we haven't even posted the job yet, but we just lost the person who does almost the exact same work, and we'd love to meet this gentleman. And so Fred got the job, and that was the first job that she got as what then became known as the church's free job list. Well, as normally happens with this, within days, it was 2, then 3, then 4. And the church's free job list, as it was then called, was founded.
Tell us a little bit about her prayer book.
Yeah, so there is, it wasn't her Bible. She had a separate Bible, but she actually had a red prayer book that she always had with her. But it was one of those things that was her personal private possession. And you could tell it wasn't for you to go looking through. She carried it with her. She had it in the hospital. She was at the hospital. She was at the nursing home. She always had it with her. And when she passed away, it was handed to me, of course, at the hospital. And I didn't feel that she would be offended if I looked at it at that point. And it was filled with the usual prayers and liturgy and things like that. But then it also had, for the last 40 years, comments written in the margin about various things troubling her, various relationships, and mostly her walk with God and recentering. So the handwritten quotes here, on December 20th of 1981, I had left out before that she became a commissioned lay distributor and of the Eucharist in the church. She wanted to help in some way. And she wrote at that point, open quotes here, so much since Our Father, June 1980, close quotes, which is how I know that that's the Our Father that changed like everything for her. Also interesting, there was another quote that says, "My word for centering, Abba," which is, if you go back to languages, Abba is the loving Father, the one who forgives all, who wants to help you. It's the New Testament Father, if you will. It's not, Zeus with lightning bolts and things like that. It's the loving Father that we should all pray to, at least if you're a Christian, believing that. Also, she wrote in the margins, and I think many people will understand this. I hope especially that Catholics would understand this. It's the center of our belief system, is she wrote, "O communion, a taste of heaven," which is just so true and a beautiful way of saying that. She also states, and this is interesting because I always wondered why she shied away from, many of the awards, like she would do them if she had to, but you could tell she really didn't want that. She wanted to avoid it. She would always put some other volunteer up front to talk to someone if they came by, if possible, and things like that, or pass it off that it was someone else's achievement at all times. But she actually wrote in this book, "I will try to be anonymous. I do what I do for you. My sweet Jesus, sometimes people see, but that is not why I do it. Just because I want to love you back, that's why." She also wrote in the margins, "I worry so about your poor. Lord, the old ones, the hungry ones, help me, help them. I see you in them and my babies." And when she says my babies, she's not speaking of my brother and I. She's speaking largely of unborn children and children in bad homes, and really all children. There wasn't a child ever born that she didn't love, or unborn for that matter. And then on, like I said before, May 12, 1981, she was received into the Order of Carmel, the Carmelite, Discalced Carmelite nuns. And she writes a lot about what a wonderful experience that was and the walk with the other sisters there that really helped her to focus her life. She also wrote, lastly, "He truly dwells in me. There is no more Barb Cordell. He absorbs me." And that notation was at about the time that she was really deeply engaging in what became the community free job list, which we'll talk about in a moment, and Pater Noster, that it just became an overwhelming feeling of, I found it. I found the niche. This is where I'm supposed to be. That most of the other things took a backseat to what it was that God wanted, the theology.
Are there events from her childhood that may have influenced her later choices?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think her walk with Jesus started very early, and there are examples of the things that I've talked about from the Our Father that go way back. I think before she even realized these were playing a role in her life. So she was born in 1939. She has a sister and three brothers. Um, they lived in a normal household that during that period of time did not have much money. There were the normal parental issues. Mother and father both worked. And so from a very early age, my mom essentially raised her brothers and sisters. She was the oldest. And even they would agree that she was very much the mother figure and grew up with that kind of loving, nurturing from moment one. An event that can't go without being talked about is that when she was 9 years old, she was walking to school with her brother, and a apparently potentially intoxicated but reckless driver driving a massive dump truck full of steel was about to hit them. And instead of just getting out of the way, my mother turned and grabbed him and pulled him out of the way. Sorry. And this was all witnessed and things by people at the scene and such, as what you'd expect. It was on a busy street. When the truck hit her, it ruptured her spleen, caused other internal damage, and the tires caught on her leg, her left leg, and drug her down the street. She wound up being hospitalized for this and had to have her spleen removed and such, and had dozens of surgeries trying to fix the leg, revascularize the leg. Now you got to remember, this is back in 1949, not now where we have lots of other ways of doing things and microsurgery and stuff. And they did everything they could, but the leg was infected. It wasn't getting better. She was getting what's called pinch grafts, which in the old days, the skin grafts weren't like we do now. They would literally pinch skin off from certain parts of the body, put it on the damaged part of the body and hope that it stuck, literally. And it just wouldn't stick because of the infection. So the doctors were talking to her and her parents about having to amputate her leg below the knee because the infection just wouldn't get better. And the nuns were coming by at my mom's request daily to give her communion and to talk with her and things. And as is common with Catholics, because she was living at the hospital for over a year, many Catholics will keep some holy water at their home. And she kept a little vial of holy water and have the nuns bring back more. And what the nuns didn't really know was happening is with the dressing changes, my mother started praying that, God, it's your will. If I'm to lose my leg, I'll lose it. But I'd kind of like to keep it. And she would sprinkle the holy water on her leg. And so when that started, the leg miraculously, and those are the words used by the doctors there, by the way, got better. And she wound up not needing to have an amputation. Now, she still had problems with her leg and things like that, but she was able to be one mean jitterbug queen in high school and dance cha-cha and things like that. So it was a pretty miraculous thing. And the doctors who took care of her at that point very openly said they had no medical explanation for why she's not losing her leg. And yet she didn't lose the leg. Now, there's another story from that period that my mother pretty much swore me never to tell while she was alive, and she only told her closest confidants, which is that she had an out-of-body experience, I should say. During one of her surgeries, she was clinically dead. She died during the surgery. I'm not sure if that was with the spleen and initially or a different surgery, but at some point, something happened during the surgery where she was clinically dead. And as they were trying to resuscitate her, she remembers feeling, and these are her description, yes, she saw light, but more than that, she felt warmth. She said it was the immense feeling of love. It wasn't fear. And she could look down and see the resuscitation actually happening. Now, we hear these stories not infrequently. Others have had similar events. But the thing that sets this event apart, at least in my mind as a physician especially, was that when they resuscitated her and she came back to, she told them this, and she could tell from their expressions that they were like not terribly believing until she made the following comment. she looked at the doctor and told him that his pen could be found under a cart behind her. The pen fell when she was dead. There's no way she could have known that unless she was in a different position in the room at a time when she was dead. And so some people are non-believers. I understand that. But I've yet to come up as a physician with a good physical understanding for how that could possibly happen. And the people involved in the surgery certainly were suddenly convinced that something really strange just happened. Along that line, after that event occurred, there was massive bills. You can imagine being in the hospital for over a year. And her parents decided to take the company that owned the truck to court. And all this is in some articles which I've provided and were in, I believe, the Akron newspaper. But basically, there was a lawsuit that was apparently one of the largest lawsuits because of the time she was in the hospital and that she survived, that had come before just to cover the bills. And when the reporters asked her why she didn't accept the much smaller settlement, which would have bankrupted, the family still would have been bankrupt even if they took the settlement. It wouldn't have even covered the bills. Her response at the age of 11 was, and I hope I get this right, it may not be a direct quote, but essentially she said, if it is God's will that I will get this money for my family, then it will happen. If it's not God's will, that's okay. I'll be fine. And that was always, her whole life from the age of 11, that was the response you would get from her on various things like this. And so sure enough, not only did they win that lawsuit, but then there was an out of court settlement for an additional, I think it was $20,000 that came almost immediately following, because clearly they were in the wrong. And, the truck never should have been there to hit these children. But it was just, the important part of that story is two things. One, that her trust in God, her be not afraid, don't worry, it's going to work out, was even there at 11. And that what was left of the money after the hospital bills helped to fund her nursing school, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But before I do, I wanted to mention that she then, after grade school, she went on to go to school at St. Mary's of the Springs here in Columbus, Ohio. And I think from everything she always told me, she loved it, had great friends and things there. But I think a couple of points to make about that is one, she met while there a newly ordained priest, Father Elmer Worth, who unfortunately passed away, I believe, in October of last year. And they became lifelong confidants and friends, writing to each other back and forth, which was something of a feat because he was a Maryknoll priest who did wonderful work in Taiwan and China and actually wrote 2 books for the Pope on religion in China. And yet they had a personal, deep friendship and religious relationship. Interestingly, Father Worth also called my mother and a couple of her friends the Three Musketeers because he was, counseling with them and talking with them things. And I don't know what happened to one of the Three Musketeers, but I know the other one became a Dominican nun, and my mother wound up with her mission and becoming a Carmelite nun. And I think it's an important learning lesson to think about who you keep as friends, because I'm pretty sure if those are your friends, you've got a good chance of making it in the future. So from there, she left there and became a nurse, licensed practical nurse, which was more common in that day. A couple of just very brief, interesting points about that was she actually received counseling by the nuns in the nursing school because they felt that her mental health may be in jeopardy in the future because she cared too much as a nurse, maybe cared too much to be a nurse. And I can remember thinking when I was young and I heard this from relatives and stuff, how crazy it is. But as a physician, I totally understand where they were coming from and thinking that. You do have to be able to separate things sometimes. And my mom was never good at that, which is probably why she was so good at what she did with Pater Noster and, climbing on the bed and hugging and holding and providing that relationship was because she really understood health care, not disease management. And health care today and then is so much more about disease management than it is about actual care. And yet, I always think now as an adult that it's very Patch Adams-like, but her approach, they would have probably been great friends if they ever met, because she felt the same way. In fact, the other thing she got in a little trouble with in nursing is that she grew up, and especially when she was in the hospital, she couldn't walk, she couldn't do things. So she learned to use marionettes, the puppets on strings. And she would do marionette therapy with her patients and talk to them, especially the kids, but even the adults. And they all thought she was crazy. But the patients didn't think she was crazy. It actually gave them joy and happiness. And, as I'm now older and I look back at all these things, there's a pattern. It's very clear that her whole life has been about that degree of caring and trust in God. And I think that's all important. Now, cycle back forward now. So we have the church's free job list that she's working at. This is around my table at home. There are file cabinets. There are volunteers coming and phones ringing, papers everywhere. And they literally got, hundreds of people jobs just from my kitchen table. And it was an incredible service to the community. And there are some videos from, I don't remember which channels, but some of the TV stations that would come out and video our kitchen, and her work there. And it was interesting because she just said, I'm still not hitting the neediest people. And so what basically happened was that she wanted to reach more people. So they moved down to the hilltop. And when they moved down to the hilltop, they were afraid that people would see the name Church's Free Job List and think that it was only if you're Catholic, only if you're a Christian, only if you have an organized religion at all, and she didn't want that because she never thought in that way at all. So she changed the name to the Community Free Job List because it's really about the community. I mean, church and faith are the paramount of importance to her, but not for her work. Her work was about the community. So she started the Community Free Job List. And this was down on the hilltop. Now, I got to tell you that the job, getting jobs for people was still the major focus and took the front room, if you will. But there was a lot more going on there that maybe intentionally wasn't out in the open for everyone to see. And I'm going to talk just briefly about a couple of the other things happening in those walls. So she continued to get the jobs for people. They also started a new thing, which was to go to the shelters, which I'll come back to in a moment. And they said there are more needy people there who are in the shelters simply because they don't have a job. Let's help them get jobs. And so that folded in. And how that happened is interesting. I'll talk about that in a moment. But before I do, the other things that were going on at the Community Free Job List were this. There was a large pantry. There was a huge room of clothes that were donated, and she would hand those out. There were rooms above that women, especially in domestic violence situations, would secretly be given to take their children and stay. And there were even little secret codes using a smiley face that always traveled with her. It used to be on my front door, and now it's at the Community Free Job List. And that was used to signal them if it was unsafe to come back into their little, we'll call it an apartment. They weren't charged anything, but the room where they could live safely with their children. And she had no fear. So if one of the boyfriend's husbands, or usually it was the guy who was accused of being the domestic abuser, if you will, would come, she had no fear in standing up to them and telling them to leave. She wasn't big. She wasn't dangerous. She wouldn't have swatted a fly, but she had no fear. And she would just tell them to leave. And then the signal would change and the families would know they could come back. She also had another room and supplied baby items because, she firmly believed that life begins at conception and it's a human being growing. It's part of her Catholic faith, and scientifically she felt that. But she also felt that the way that you get people not to have an abortion has very little to do with the law, and it has very little to do with preaching that point or the scientific point of that. It had much more to do with giving them an alternative. So she literally stocked formula, diapers, clothes, playpens, anything people would donate that you need usually in the first year of life. And she got connections with social workers all over the city who had access to get people into social services, onto what's now WIC and those kinds of things, and all the programs. And she would sit down with these mothers waiting to deliver their infants and talk with them and show them, we can do this, 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 and this. And a huge percentage of them, I can't give you an exact number because I don't think she kept records of this, But a huge percentage of them changed their mind and kept their baby. And many of those children and those women came back to help and be volunteers. But the number is large. I can't give you an exact number. And all of that was going on simultaneously. But then what happened was, to go back to the shelter part of her work, she was on the west side of Columbus, out by where we grew up. I think this was roughly 1985-ish, something like that. And basically there was a disheveled, obviously drunk man walking in the middle of the road and people honking and speeding by. And once again, showing what some would say is common sense, others would say fear, pulled over and said, well, obviously I have to help him. And so she went over to this gentleman and said, basically, do you have a gun or anything that you would hurt me with? And of course, he looked at her in his drunken state and said, no, I don't have a weapon. She goes, good, get in the car. Where can I take you? And, I think most of us would think, wow, really? Like, you would do that even in the 80s. I certainly wouldn't have recommended that to my friends or my mother, right? But that's what she did. And he said, well, I'm staying at the shelter. And she's like, oh, where's that? And she had never been to a shelter at that point. And he took her to the, I think it was a men's shelter at this point, down to the men's shelter. And she saw the cots. And, there are some pictures and things we've shared on that. And she was just blown away that people were living in this condition. So she stayed there for most of the day talking to them. And she learned from them that many of them were just like you and I. They just had bad luck. They lost their job. And in that day, getting a new job, especially if you didn't have many skills, was nearly impossible. Many families were there. And so she started trying to prioritize that group for jobs. And so she would call all of these employers at like a lot of the trucking industries, places where, you needed to have a strong backbone, a strong work ethic, but you didn't have to have a college degree necessarily. And, they would call her every day and say, I need 20 guys here, I need 10 guys there. And most of these owners would later say, and I've had the discussions with a few of them actually growing up when I was a young adult, that, about 1 in 20 of them were a real problem and we'd have to fire them, or they wouldn't even make it through the first day. But the other 19 were as good as anybody else they got who came in and turned in an application. But if you're living in the shelter, you're homeless, and by the way, there were no cell phones then really, it's kind of hard for them to reach out to find jobs. And so my mom just made the connection. So the Community for Jobless started working. She's now going to the shelters. They're doing all this other stuff. I mean, it was so busy down there all the time. She had a number of volunteers helping her. And then she went to the shelter one day, as is usual, and there was a gentleman there with Kaposi sarcoma, marks all over his body, and his mattress, they call it a cot, but back then they were basically just mattresses thrown on the floor, was all by itself. And there was no one around him, no one going near him. And he's like laying there sickly and very small framed, emaciated. And my mother said, well, what's going on here? And they basically said, well, he has that new disease that's killing people and we don't know what to do for him, with him, etc. And I'll talk about this in just a minute in more detail, HIV, what became HIV. But understand that at this point in 1985 well, I'll just briefly talk about this if I could, because it's probably a good time to do so. You have to understand the time period. In 80 and 81, people started getting sick, getting emaciated, getting diseases of immunosuppression and dying, and no one really knew why. And then a bunch of theories came out and a bunch of fear and a bunch of horrible accusation-like ideas came out about this disease. It was actually named various derogatory terms like gay-related immunodeficiency, gay bowel syndrome, and these kind of things. Interestingly, as I've mentioned to others, a huge percentage of hemophiliacs were getting it, but it was never called hemophiliac immunodeficiency disease. But it was going through all these different names, and really no one figured out what was going on until about 1983, when a number of researchers around the world came up with various named viruses that they thought caused this, but they knew it was a virus. At that point, they knew how roughly for sure that it was IV and IV drug, sharing needles, those kinds of things, some sexual practices, and basically blood transfusions were by far the most common ways. They knew, for example, that you didn't get it from mosquito bites. But the names were all over the place on what they should call it, HTLV, LAV, all these different acronyms and things. And then that's in 83. In 84 is when the test became available to look for the virus. And it wasn't a perfect test, but finally a way to actually test people to say, do you actually have it? Or do we have to wait until you're dying of an immunosuppressive disease to say, well, that's probably what it is. And then just to give you the time sequence, 85, 86, I think it was 86 actually, is when C. Everett Koop sent out the large amount of information that basically to all the population in the US, this is the disease, this is how you get it, this is how you don't get it, and we need to address the problems and prevent you catching it, because at that point there was really no treatment. You could treat the symptoms, you could treat some of the associated diseases, but you couldn't actually treat what later became known as AIDS. It wasn't until a year after that that all the scientists realized that all these viruses that we think are causing it are the same virus. And they then started calling it HIV. Okay. Now, after that, of course, is when in 87 is when the first drug came out for use for what is now AIDS, which was AZT. Interestingly, and this isn't a talk on the history of AIDS, but you have to have a perspective of what the times were like. Interestingly, AZT was actually invented in 1964 as an anti-cancer drug. It didn't work well for that. But when it was realized that the mechanism of action that it had been planned to use against cancer might work really well for this virus, they tried it and it did work. Okay, not great research, but it looked like it worked. So the FDA rushed it through and it was put out. But here was the problem. AZT cost in today's dollars about $20,000 a year when it came out in I think it was 87. Unless you had really good insurance that happened to cover this, which a lot of them didn't, there was no way you were going to get the drug, And so now there was a black market for it, and there was trading, and I'll give you half my dose if you take half this dose. It was a crazy time. But back on point to my mom, all this is happening around her. She sees this guy with, Kaposi sarcoma. Everyone's terrified of him. Her response was, hold my clipboard. And she walked over, sat down on the cot next to him and gave him a big hug. Remember, we didn't know for sure how you got this disease back then. She didn't care. She just said, be not afraid. Don't despair. Do what's right. And that's what she did. And so she went, after meeting him, talking with him, she literally picked up his stuff and said, come on, let's go, and took him home. Basically, he was the first patient at Pater Noster. And he took an apartment above what was the community free job list. Well, within days, suddenly she has multiple people coming, and all of them in the same situation. Usually they're the ones who have, some IV drug history or some other problems that nobody else wants to touch them. They don't have insurance. And she needed to find a way to help them. And so the first Pater Noster was opened. But now back to the times, unlike now where someone will say, oh yeah, I have AIDS and I'm on medication and, my CD4 count is this and my viral load is 0, and people don't blink an eye. Back then, this was a death sentence. If you had AIDS, you were going to die from it, okay? And usually in short order. Back then, people were terrified. And she was, for good reasons, afraid to let people in the community know that she was housing people who had this disease, because they probably would have ran her out of the building and suddenly canceled her rent. So what they did was they literally found a place a couple doors down, a much bigger, nicer, antebellum-like home, and that was the first Pater Noster one. And when new patients would come, they would come to the community-free job list, and they would shuffle them through out the back door, around, and then secretively into the new Pater Noster one house, where they lived as close to normal family communal life, not a hospital bed life, but a communal life. And that's how Pater Noster one happened.
Wasn't there a second Pater Noster?
Yeah, there was. The first Pater Noster just grew so fast. And she had wonderful, wonderful volunteers who came and helped there. And actually, I should tell you that the story of Pater Noster is not really just a story of Barb Cordell. In fact, she would say it's a story of God, okay? But it's also a story of amazing volunteers. And the interesting thing that I've talked to a lot of people about is that most of her volunteers either came from religious life or people who had the disease or other diseases or were poor themselves. But it was interesting that the way this ministry, if you will, worked is that the people who didn't have a lot were usually the ones who did the most in the ministry. And there are literally hundreds of examples of this throughout time. But yeah, so she just grew too fast. Paternoster 1 was overwhelmed with patients. They needed more space. Also, they did decide to, and I use this intentionally, they did decide at one point with Paternoster 1 to come out, and they put a big sign on it saying Paternoster, home for HIV or AIDS or something like that. And I mean, they wanted it to be, look, we're here, we're proud, we are living our life, etc. But there was also the other group that kind of didn't want that life. They wanted to have a more secluded, private life and things like that, and especially the sicker patients. So they opened Paternoster 2, which was basically a beautiful old farmhouse out on Alkire Road near Georgesville. And it had a little barn behind it. It had some goats and such, and a little bit of storage space and garage and things, and room for a chapel in the basement and a bigger kitchen. It was a nicer setup and allowed them to take many more patients. And they would generally have at least 5 patients at a time out there at the house. And then often some children also, if the kids were HIV positive, because remember back then we also didn't have medications to give to women to decrease the risk of their child having HIV. And so many of them were HIV positive at birth. And so Paternoster 2 came into being, and both of them flourished until about 1991 when Paternoster 1 was closed. And that really happened for a number of reasons. I think that could be a whole discussion, but it basically comes down to in the period of the late 80s to the early 90s, after AZT came out, and suddenly there was money and diagnostic codes for all this, AIDS treatment in the medical establishment became a moneymaker, whereas before it wasn't. So suddenly, if you had insurance or you were on public assistance and things like that, there were nursing homes opening up beds, there were hospitals opening wards that never did it before, but now that they could fund it and frankly make money from it, there was more opportunity. Also, because of AZT and it being somewhat effective, the numbers of really sick patients diminished at that point. And so it wasn't the same where you got the disease and within a year or two you were dead. It really changed the scope of the disease. So it became pretty much a practical decision to close Paternoster 1, although they hated to do it because it was a beautiful building and had so much history. But that did happen. And then Paternoster 2 continued up until about 2001 or maybe early 2002 when my mom actually, due to healthcare issues, had to give up the ministry and actually moved to Florida to help take care of her mother and carry ministry in another way. But she just couldn't continue. She had fallen and broken a hip. She had aneurysm issues. She had to get aneurysms clipped, and then just all kinds of emphysema problems from her smoking and things that made it so she couldn't continue there.
Was your mom concerned about contracting the disease?
So I think that I had this discussion a lot because remember I was in undergrad and medical school and learning all about this and things, and we had a lot of discussions about that. My mother had reasonable, realistic concerns. She followed the science, wore gloves, all that kind of stuff when she was going to be around bodily fluids. But I would say that she never had fear of catching it. Her fear was of letting the fear of catching it keep her from doing what God was asking her to do. And she made that really clear. But I will tell you, despite the gloves, despite good practices over the period of years because of her close contact with them, She had what she described once as dozens of needle sticks. Now, maybe that was hyperbole and exaggeration, but I'm sure there were a number of needle sticks. Which back then, because we didn't have post-exposure prophylaxis and things, and by the way, these patients would have had very high viral loads. The risk was actually very high. Like I, as a physician, always, even myself, said it's kind of amazing that you didn't contract the disease from the needle sticks that she had, the number of needle sticks. And I'm not the only one who felt that way, because in fact, some of the researchers from the CDC, I believe it was, actually were quite interested in why didn't she catch this either with her practice and interactions. And so a few times they would literally send a team out and they would draw her blood to look for, because there were a few people like this, not just my mom, who they were like, you really should have this disease. And they wanted to see, is there something about their immune system that prevents them from getting it or gives them some level of protection? So I'm sure they were looking at, natural killer cells and T cells and antibodies and all that kind of thing. But it was funny when I had these discussions with my mother, she'd go, they're happy to look, but they're looking for the wrong shield. And it wasn't that she didn't believe in the science, but she did believe that if God wants me to continue this work, he's not going to let me die here of AIDS and not be able to do the work. So in his own time, maybe I'll get it. But right now, I got too much work to do. And so she never lived her life in fear of it. And I think from the number of times that she would literally crawl up and hug patients and interact with them and had unintentional exposures, it never changed her practice. She never wore a body armor suit. She never, put on a hazmat suit or anything like that. She just took care of patients.
Were there other priests who helped your mom in the Pater Noster?
There were too many probably for me to name, but I would like to at least say the following. One is that when priests go through training and deacons go through training, part of what they're trying to learn is the walk of Christ. And in the Catholic Church and in most Christian faiths, the poor actually, are the most blessed, if you will. Give us your needy, your poor, your hungry, etc. And we view that that's how Jesus believes. It's much harder for a rich person who's got everything and no struggles to get to heaven than it is for the poor, kind of thing. So some of the training programs would literally send their candidates to become priests and deacons to the Pater Noster homes to basically work there, volunteer there, and see basically God, Christ at work, through her mission. And so many of them passed through and did education there and did wonderful things and services. But two, I have to mention. One of them is Father Thomas Cadden, who died in 2004, I believe. He was amazing. He was, I've read many of his sermons, heard many of his sermons, had the opportunity to talk with him. And here was his deal, in my view. He was a person than a priest. So he would come to Pater Noster, and almost always all of the Roman collar, the black attire, the priestly look disappeared. And you would find him out, and I always laughed about this because remember, he's a priest, he's kind of the shepherd. You would find him out feeding the goats, wrapped in his arms, kind of like some of the visions we have of, the Lamb of God and all that. I mean, it was kind of like sometimes kind of shocking. You'd see this, but he would also hold the patients as lambs, as just, wonderful, loving person. And it was interesting that I think if you ever needed his priestly duties, he was there for that. He did Mass. He would, give the Eucharist to those who wanted to do last rites. But more than that, he was there just to be there and be a part of it and to help them in any way they wanted and to be friends and to play games and to cook, clean, whatever it was. And that was really, I think, for many people, they hadn't seen a priest in that capacity, that was kind of, if you think to St. Francis in that, he just enveloped himself in the culture and being a part of the family. And it meant a lot to all the patients who went through there, I think, and of course my mom as well. And I have to tell you a funny story about that, actually, because my mom had put out an ad, I guess, saying, I need someone who wants to come and work at Pater Noster. I need them to be able to do the following things, cooking, cleaning, helping with the patient care, etc. And the pay is nothing. And the benefits are you get to say the Our Father with us each day if you choose to join us. And I don't think she had a whole lot of people return the application, but Father Cadden actually returned an application. And I won't belabor this other than to say he lists the many, many different not-for-profit organizations and religious organizations and amazing things he had done in his career. But then he had a couple of humorous moments too, where when it said, in case of emergency, who should we contact? Father Cadden wrote, God, which I thought was pretty interesting. And when it said, do you have any special skills? He said, well, I can do math as a special skill, which of course it is a super special skill. But just the way he did it is it's so reminiscent of the way he was. He was just like this, like almost a comedic way of saying, I'm here for you, Barb. They remained friends till the day he died in 2004. It was one of the hardest days of her life. But she acknowledged that it's hard because she misses him, but she's absolutely certain that if she's lucky enough to go to heaven, he'll be there waiting for her. So he is one of the most amazing priests. Now, the other priest that comes to mind who I think holds a very special place is Father DeVille, who actually is still with us and works out of the chancery here in Columbus, Ohio. Once again, amazing priest, had socialized with all the patients and volunteers and provided, counseling, just amazing thing. And in fact, amazing person. And in fact, after my mother passed away, we had to wait a year to have her memorial service because of COVID, of course. And Father DeVille was kind enough to actually help in officiating her memorial mass, which meant so much to the family, the volunteers, those from Pater Noster who came to the memorial mass. And I'm absolutely certain my mother was, I'm certain in heaven smiling that Father DeVille was a part of that. Just amazing guy who gave so much and still does give so much to the community.
Your mother put herself in a lot of dangerous situations, it seems. Was she ever afraid during this time?
I think she had realistic fears, but she really did follow, as I think I said before, the be not afraid, don't disparage, I'm going to be there with you if you're doing my work. There are a number of examples, not only of things that are potential violent situations, but frankly, situations where like you're out of money, you're not going to be able to pay the rent, you don't have a car, all these kind of things that I would talk about, and just about how that folds in with the generosity that she had. So a couple quick anecdotal stories. There was a time there was a what they used to call a shooting gallery somewhere off of Parsons Avenue. I don't remember exactly where it was. I used to know exactly, but basically it was a house that everybody knew in the area was a place that people went to shoot drugs. And it was run by the gangs in that area. And when you would see the house, there would be at least two basically guards standing on the porch, armed, of course. And it was a scary place. It was also being observed by the police. Apparently, they knew it was a shooting gallery also, at which point my mother found out that through someone at the home, she found out that one of her clients had unfortunately gone back to using shooting drugs and was at that house because he wasn't in the bed he was supposed to be in. And so most people would have said, well, he's out of the bed, he's out of the house. We have plenty of other people to take the bed. Not Barb. Barb instead gets in the car, drives down to the house where they told her that he had gone, and marches right up the stairs with her Bible in hand. Now, the police officers, and I know this because she had a great relationship with many of the police officers, and later a few of them told us the story from their perspective. But basically, the two police officers saw Barb get out of her car and just walk right up the stairs of the shooting gallery towards the big guys with guns. And they commented that we wouldn't have done that without a SWAT team for backup. But my mother didn't care. She walked up, she talked to the two guys, explained that with their permission or without, that her Bible trumped their evil, and she was going in to get her guy out. Wasn't going to cause trouble, wasn't calling anybody, but she was going to get so-and-so out of this facility, and there was nothing they could do to stop that unless they wanted to go against God. And both of them apparently were pretty dumbfounded. this, old Italian looking woman just basically told him to get out of her way. And she actually joked that when she opened the door, one of them grabbed the handle and sort of held her for her, which is how she knew things were going to probably be okay. So she went in, she got the guy out, helped pick him up, walk him out. On the way out, she stopped to pray with them and tell them that they're making bad decisions, gave them each a card and said, you should come and see me. We can help you with this. Now, I don't know if they ever showed up, but she walked back out in her car, drove the person back to his bed. And the police officers, like I said they were just blown away. They thought for sure she was going to be beaten to death or something. And they would have to go try to rescue her without a SWAT team. And they were pretty amazed. But then there are many other examples of just this lack of fear of the unknown or going out of business. Let me give you a couple examples. Paternoster 2 is a farmhouse. It's on an Alkire Road, which back then wasn't really that well traveled. It was farmland. And they literally ran out of money for rent. They had no money, rent is due, and she is terrified they're going to have to get foreclosed. This was one of the few times that I was actually directly involved, calling people, trying to get somebody to give money, whatever. And some people driving down Alkire pulled into her driveway to ask directions. And when they conversed and she explained what the place was, they wrote her a check for thousands of dollars. What are the chances? Zero. That just doesn't happen. But it happened to her. That randomly someone wanting directions suddenly says, oh, let me get my checkbook. I happen to have quite a bit of money. Here's some. And covered them for at least that month. It was covered. There was another time like that where their car had broken down. They didn't have a vehicle to transport the patients back and forth, to the hospital, those who weren't bedbound. And she was desperately in need of a car and trying to figure out, how am I going to be able to provide this transportation, because they can't really stay here if I can't get them back and forth to the doctors. And although some of the family doctors in the community actually would come to her occasionally, many of them couldn't, and the specialists. So there's no solution. And then I believe it was the St. Vincent de Paul, it may have been the Kiwanis, but a religious-related organization showed up one day and said, Barb, we have this wheelchair van that we don't really need. Do you think you could find someone who could use it? And it was just that kind of story happened again and again and again. Whenever there was a need for subsistence, it just showed up. It was crazy. Now, not only was she good at getting things, though, I have to tell you, she always gave everything. She gave. Another example of that is she was very cold-natured. She was always freezing in Columbus. One of the reasons she moved to Florida also was with her health. The cold she couldn't handle it anymore. So my wife and I came back from where we were living at the time, and we bought her this super nice, subarctic coat and gloves. You could go in Alaska with this thing and walk the tundra and be warm. And we gave it to her for Christmas. And she was very appreciative, tried it on, loved it. Truly you could tell. It was oh my God, this is so wonderful. And then we went to dinner at her then favorite restaurant, which was Spaghetti Warehouse down, I think, on West Broad Street. And as we walked in, there was a homeless person who I remember this person because they had clothing wrapped on them, kind of like you see in the old biblical movies. It wasn't like the usual, they've got gloves with a hole. They literally had towels wrapped on their arms because it's freezing cold, Christmas time in Columbus. And so we go in, we sit down, and we ordered. And my mother excused herself to go to the bathroom. And I remember thinking, gosh, she is cold-blooded. She still has her coat and gloves on. And we're in the middle of the Spaghetti Warehouse, which they heat. And then she came back from the bathroom, and the coat and gloves were missing. She came back without the coat and gloves. And I'm like, Mom, did you leave your coat and gloves? We got to go get those. Trust me, they're going to get stolen, And she goes, oh, no, there's no reason. I gave them away. Remember that nice person we saw standing outside? They needed them more than me. And this was literally hours after we gave her the coat and gloves. I can't think of a better example from St. Francis's lessons and teaching than that, and the fact that you didn't learn things from Barb from what she told you. She was very much preaching by her actions and only used words when absolutely necessary. And she lived that. So that's just a couple examples. I'm sure I could come up with many other examples where things would just arrive. They would just show up when she needed them. And other times when she would give things away. And I will just end this section by saying, she ended her life in the same way. Before she died, she talked to me, knew I was a physician, and told me that some of her other family members were against donation. They didn't understand it, but that she wanted to make sure that I made sure that she had the opportunity to donate anything that could help another human being if she died. And she said, look, I know it's a lot to ask you, but I'm putting it on you. You need to make sure this happens. And so, the way my mind works, I get, the paperwork saying that I get that decision-making capacity. If someone in the family disagrees with it and things, she wasn't worried about that. She knew I'd find a way, as she usually would. And then she passed away. So I approached the hospital staff, and being a physician who's worked in emergency departments, I've been involved with this decision for others, not my mother, but others many, many, many times. So I approached the hospital staff, the nurse, all wonderful, and said, look, this is her wishes. Can you have your life share person get in touch with me? And they did. Wonderful. But then I learned a really interesting fact. Once again, Barb was about to break down more barriers and do something again for the first time. And the reason that I say that is this particular hospital had just finished all their protocols with the Life Share organization and had never done one of these whole donations before. And so they came to me and they were like, are you sure? We hope we don't make any mistakes in how we approach this. This is our first time, et cetera, et cetera. But they did an amazing, fantastic job. And I think actually brought some of my other family members to see how valuable this was. So my mother left the world once again giving of herself. Which is just so much her life that, even in dying, she's still giving. So anyway.
Are there any other examples of things being provided?
Yeah, there are actually. There's many of them, but I'll give you a couple quick examples. One, my mother always desired to, most people want to covet things and have a lot of money when they die. My mother said, I want to die with nothing. And for the record, when she died, she had $6.18 to her name, with a note that said, please give this to my brother, which astounded me that was exactly how she would have wanted it. But back to these kind of other stories, when one of her early patients was brought in, this was probably 85-ish time frame. The story was they brought him in an ambulance. The personnel in the ambulance were in hazmat suits. They pretty much pushed him, here you go, all yours, because they were terrified and uneducated. Because at that point, they should have known better, to be honest. And then they apparently drove the ambulance back to this small community in Ohio and burned the ambulance. When that information got out, everybody at the house was very upset. I couldn't believe it. How disrespectful, ridiculous, unnecessary. And I remember my mother saying, well, that's just human nature and sad. But what's really sad is we could have used that ambulance for our mission and things. Why didn't they just leave it? We would have taken it. And I just thought, wow, what an interesting way to take this situation and turn it into if only they'd asked. And it's a lesson for all of us, because sometimes I think we fall into this too, where if you only asked other people about some of the things you think are garbage, you think you don't need, they actually may be very valuable to others. That being said, I'll give you one other example of things just freely being given. When both Pater Noster homes were running, what most people don't realize is there were many people she was helping to take care of who were at home also. They were with their families. So they weren't located at the Pater Noster homes, but they were still getting some nursing care. She would go out and visit them. They were getting, food items and support and help getting back and forth to their doctor's appointments with the wheelchair van and things. And I don't know an exact number, but probably at least as many in the community as were at the Pater Noster homes. Well, one of the problems she ran into was, and with some of the regulations and stuff, was she had to have better beds than what she was being given and donated, and she didn't have enough beds to take care of the patients. So I was in medical school in Cincinnati at that point, and she called, and we would always talk about the problems and, hey, Randy, do you have any ideas about this? And I was like, wow, Mom, I don't, but, those things are expensive. They're like $8,000, $10,000 a piece for these beds. You don't have the money to go buy a bunch of hospital beds. or those kinds of beds? Because I know, but I have to, we've got to figure this out. Well, that day or the next day, because in medical school, you pretty much are always working. That's how it works, kind of thing. I was working and I was going between hospitals. I went into this basement corridor of the University of Cincinnati Hospital, and they had dozens of hospital beds lined up on the walls. And something in my head, for reasons I have no idea why, said, find out why those beds are here. And so I found a gentleman who worked in the shipping department, I guess, whatever that would be called, and said, do you know why all these beds are here? And he said, yes, we're getting rid of them. Once again, coincidence? I don't think so. So I explained the situation. He goes, yeah, we can't do that. He goes, you can't just, I said, can I buy them from you for something cheap, whatever? And he said, no, you really can't. He said, basically, you have to do a bid, and then the highest bid wins because of it being a state facility or something. I don't understand all that. But basically, and I'm in medical school. I'm not a legal scholar. But he said, you have to bid on them. And I said, okay, what's the lowest bid? And he goes, well, it's not the lowest bid. He goes, it'll be the highest bid. And I said, well, how does that work? He goes, well, you write your bid down on this piece of paper, and I have to post it. And then you come back, and I forget if it was a week or what. And he goes, if you're the highest bid, then we'll give them to you if you have transportation for them and can load them. I said, all right, well, it's worth a shot. So I wrote $1 on the bid sheet because I figured if I put 100, anybody who's going to bid higher is going to bid thousands, right? So I put $1, and I watched him take my bid, pull off 2 garage sale things from the post board, put it under it, and put the garage sales back on top. It wasn't by accident. I came back, I think it was a week later, and he goes, yeah, miraculously, nobody seemed to respond to the bid request, so you won. Now you have to figure out how to get them out of here. And I was like, oh, wait a second. How many are there? And I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 40 hospital beds or something, or maybe more. It was like a whole hallway. And so I talked to my mom again, and I'm like, Mom, now what? I mean, what am I going to drive back and forth from Cincinnati to Ohio 40 times with a U-Haul trailer? I mean, I don't have time to do that. And she's like, well, let's pray about it and we'll see what happens. She called me back. I think it was probably the same day, maybe the next morning, and said, yeah, it's no problem. We got this covered. And I was like, okay, what's coming now? I'm like, how? She goes, well, some truckers showed up and they're going to be doing a line haul or whatever they call that between places. And they just happened to have empty trucks coming back through Cincinnati from Kentucky. And they said, as long as you can get people to help them load them, they'll be there, they'll pick them up and they'll drop them off and have guys here empty them. And I'm like, you're kidding, right? She goes, nope, that's how God works. And sure enough, me and a couple of my friends helped them to load them. And suddenly she had more hospital beds than she knew what to do with and was able to distribute them. Had to buy the mattresses, but that's much less cost, So anyway, that's just a few of the examples of just the way God worked through her that were astounding.
So your mom also worked with federal agencies about legislation dealing with children and access to school and facilities?
Yeah. So back in the 80s, if a child had HIV, they weren't allowed to go to school. They would have like separate areas to go and things like that because of the fear, which was irrational. I mean, it started off rational before we knew about how it was transmitted, but then it became quite irrational. But it didn't change the laws then. And what happened is that, and I have to go back a little bit, is that a wonderful woman came and stayed at Pater Noster named Sonia, who unfortunately, roughly a year later, died of AIDS. When she arrived, Sonia was pregnant and delivered a baby there who unfortunately was also HIV positive. When Sonia died, normally the child would be put up for adoption, foster care, except in that era and that day, there was no one willing to do foster care or adopt this young baby. So once again, my mom said, if not me, then who? And so the next thing I know, she says, guess what? I'm a grandma. And she adopted the child. And that child and she maintained the closest of relationships for the rest of her life. He was at her side when she died. They talked multiple times a day on the phone. In fact, more than I spoke with my mother, he would speak with her until the day she died. And the interesting part about that was that child and her are one of the reasons that the laws got changed and that she was asked to be a part of writing the legislation. What happened was she went shopping at a large Kroger's, and they used to have a little play area in the store. And she appropriately made sure they had gloves and things, and they did, like they would treat any child who got a bump or a scrape. And so she dropped him off to play. Well, when they gave her the paperwork to fill out about medical things, she was truthful and wrote that. They called her on the overhead, called her back, and said, absolutely not. He can't play here. He's got to go. Well, he was devastated. And she was mad. And she said, their ignorance is astounding. This is not like some little mom and pop shop where maybe they don't know. This is a place, at that point, I think the largest grocery chain in the country. They should have people who know better. So she tried to educate them, and it went nowhere. I mean, they were like, yeah, we get it. Nope, we're not letting these children play in the things. So she basically reached out to get an attorney, got an attorney, and essentially sued Kroger's to have them explain why it is they wouldn't. It wasn't about money. In fact, that wasn't even, the suit wasn't about money at all. It was about, we want you to change your rules and allow these kids to come and play. It wound up being that the attitudes changed. Kroger actually had her involved in their process. They then changed the rules and did allow these kids to go and play. And then subsequent to that, because of her involvement with that, the federal agencies working on laws related to Board of Education and the schools, or Department of Education, I should say, in schools, approached her to look over and assist with legislation to allow kids back into public schools and to be mainstreamed into public schools who have HIV. So probably a very small part that she played, but once again, it's the same thing. She heard a calling. She didn't turn around and walk away. She just said, well, I guess it's my turn to roll here too, and did what she could. And remember, my mom was very smart. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. She had an LPN degree and she had tons of common sense for many things, but she wasn't the PhD, MD, JD kind of, CEO of a company. But it didn't take that to reach them once they kind of saw where she was coming from a position of love and science, that it's just what we should do. And they wound up actually, as she said, being wonderful. The Kroger's people wound up being wonderful and doing everything they could and helping in many other ways. They just had fear and ignorance that stood in the way of them doing the right thing until she forced them to face that. Once they did, it was better for all kids.
So your mom also started a needle exchange program?
Yeah, I jokingly say that my mom started the needle exchange program before it became mainstream also. In fact, she saw all these mostly young men, but also young women who were using IV drugs coming and dying of AIDS. And just like she would hand out condoms to help prevent people who were going to have sex from getting AIDS, HIV and AIDS, she thought, well, why aren't we giving needles and syringes to IV drug users? I mean, there's clearly no evidence and no way one could rationally think that giving a non-user a needle and a syringe would suddenly turn them into a user. That makes no sense. And that's how she saw it. So she, on her own, started this program through the Pater Noster homes and the community free job list of a needle exchange, and bought a bunch of big red boxes, for incineration, and they would bring them in, dump theirs in, get new ones, what they call the works. That way they didn't have to share them. There was no reason to share them. When they were dirty, they'd get rid of them. They would get new ones. From a community standpoint, they didn't throw them on the ground where kids would step on them and get stuck, because they'd bring them to her, and she had a medical disposal facility there. It wasn't cheap, but she did it. Well, unfortunately, my mom had two real downsides. She was horrible at finances because, honestly, she didn't care about them. She never cared to learn about finances. She was horrible with money. She would tell you that. And she was horrible at record keeping. So along with this came a couple other government agency involvement. She's getting bigger, and they wanted this records and those records. And they were really unhappy about a needle exchange program, at that point. And so when they came to her and said, we want your records of all of this and that, and your, I think it was, they came and asked for all the records, finance records, which had nothing to do with the needle exchange program. She said, that is not a problem. I will get them for you. And she came back with boxes of paper plates that she had written notes all over about different expenses and all this kind of stuff, and said, here you go. And they were like, what's this? And she goes, that's my note keeping. Whatever's handy, I grab, because I'm taking care of a patient. and I'm in their room and I'm not about to go walk back to the office when I'm in the middle of an IV change or catheter change or dressing change. So I write it on a paper plate or whatever happens to be in the room. So some of them had like, peanut butter and jelly smudges across them and things. And she was always like, this is nonsense. This doesn't change a thing. So they really focused then on the needle exchange issue. And they were like, well, we want you to stop this. And she's like, well, I appreciate your opinion, but no, I won't stop it because it's saving lives. And they were like, well, frankly, we're the health department. You have to stop it. And she said, no, actually, I don't. And I'm not going to. And it became a big problem. Like I'm getting calls now with my mom going, yeah, they're telling me I'm going to go to jail. And, they're going to maybe close me down, but God's telling me not to stop this. And so I'm not. And I'm, going, oh my gosh, this is not going to end well at all. And she's like, once again, be not afraid. Don't worry. Don't be disturbed. It will be fine. So now you have to remember, I'm a medical student. I'm reading like crazy. I'm in the journals and I'm trying to just get all this information. And it just so happens that one of the journals that pretty much every medical student reads had an article put out like that month or like within a month of this whole event going on that was about a San Francisco needle exchange program that they started. And the evidence that they showed, as I recall, I don't have the article in front of me, but basically it was saving thousands of lives. They were highly recommending that all cities start doing this. And, that it's not increasing the drug problem. It was all pro, you should do this. So I sent it to my mom with a little note saying, you might want to share this with the health department. She did. And then to the health department's credit, two things followed that. As I recall, timeline a long time ago but two things followed it. One was they stopped nagging her about the needle exchange program and actually started their own version of it after consulting with her and finding out what had worked and not worked with her, which she was thrilled about because think about the scope. She's got a couple little centers. They've got the state of Ohio, right? I mean, and can put them in all different places. So once again, that probably saved many, many, many lives, not only from HIV and AIDS, but from hepatitis and various other diseases also, and became a standard pretty much around the country. So she didn't go to jail, although she thought she was about to. The other thing that kind of came from that is it later came out that I had sent her the article and I started having discussions with the health department. And on one of my breaks, I had the distinct honor to work with amazing people and teach HIV education around the city of Columbus to literally all age groups. Of course, it was a different message for each age group, but it gave me that opportunity to actually teach HIV and AIDS education to mostly teenagers, which was one of the highlights of my young adult life, was doing that and working with some of the people from the health department that I was fortunate enough to work with.
Were there regular volunteers who helped at the houses?
There were many regular volunteers who did tremendous work with her. I wish I could remember all of their names and talk about each of them, but I will just briefly talk about four of them who I think deserve special mention. One of them was Aggie, who was a member of the LGBTQ community, like us all, had her own issues, but did amazing things to help people, partially because she could relate to some of the problems they were facing. So, she worked there for years. She remained friends with my mom for years, and was just such a blessing to Pater Noster that it has to be mentioned that her work there was just grand and wonderful in all ways. Despite some, like all of us, have some limitations and problems, she just did amazing things. The other one that I have to mention is Glenn. Glenn probably worked there, I think, probably the longest as a volunteer. And he was what kept my mother out of trouble because he did understand the paperwork, the grant writing, the keeping better records, the part that she hated, and trying to keep her out of you're about to run out of money kind of thing, and all of that kind of stuff he was instrumental in. And he also provided care to the patients and help whenever needed. But Glenn actually was there with me when my mother died, and she would have wanted it no other way because he was literally, she called him her other son, regularly referred to him as her other son. They were that close. So the other two I would mention would be, one is David Kirby, who everybody would know from Time magazine and the Benetton ads as the face of AIDS, if you will. But the face that they're seeing is, the likeness of Jesus that wasn't intended, but it's obvious. No one can deny that, or at least the Cesare Borgia version of Jesus. There's no doubt that you can see that, and you see the passion, the love of Christ in that face. But what most people don't understand is that's not what he looked like before. And in fact, he was deeply engaged in being an advocate for the communities affected by AIDS long before he got sick. And he was very involved in what became HIV and AIDS education. He was a mover, a shaker, a brilliant man doing lots of great work who wanted his photo to be taken. And I'll leave that to the photographer possibly to talk in detail about. But my mom actually wrote a letter about this topic, that he and his family wanted these photos to be taken because he felt it was a way to reach people, to get them to understand. It was like his effort to actually be an advocate just one more time. And it was a beautiful thing. And the photos are just amazing. So I think it has to be noted that, he was a volunteer and helpful in so many ways in the city as well, that he should get some recognition for that. The other person is one of the most interesting people I've ever known, which is Peta. And Peta was American Indian who lived at the homes, was a volunteer, and then ultimately died there of AIDS. But he was just constantly, making people smile, being happy. He would do anything for anyone while there. Now, I joke and say you never knew if he was going to come down in men's clothing or women's clothing. You just didn't know. Would he have makeup on today or not have makeup on today? But what you did know was he was going to be the light of any. If he walked in the room, he was suddenly the light in the room. He was, everybody wanted to communicate with him and talk to him. And he was a genuinely awesome guy. And I guess that's just the easiest way to say it. He treated everyone well and was just wonderful. And it was actually interesting to talk to him about spiritual things also, with his unique background, being American Indian, living at a home where the director is obviously Catholic, and people of all faiths are there. I remember there was a Hindu person there at one point, many people, many Muslim individuals. And then there was Peta, who I think, as far as I know, was the only person that had some background with American Indian, not only medicine, but religion. And great guy and fantastic volunteer. My mom was crushed when each of these, three of those four individuals I've mentioned died. They were just, very difficult for her because she just loved them all so dearly.
So your mom ran Pater Noster much like a family home. Can you share some examples of that?
Absolutely, yeah. So my mother wanted this to be a family. She really did believe in the body of Christ and the family of Christ, the family nature of a belief for Christians and such. And she felt that all of these people were her brothers and sisters. And she couldn't figure out why hospitals always wanted to have everything be, I hate to use the term, sterile. You get served a meal on a tray, it's shoved on your desk, and the person walks out. The person gives you a medicine through your IV, they walk out. There's, especially now, being in the healthcare field, there's almost no time for that personal touch between doctors and nurses. What we call the doctor-patient relationship, for example, is extraordinarily detailed because the turnaround time, you're supposed to go see someone in 5 minutes, and it's impossible to actually maintain that. Well, my mom wouldn't have any of the current way, even back then the medicine was being provided for these people. She would bring them in as patients, but she didn't call them patients. They were clients, friends, they were family. Everyone was family. So, for example, meals were at dinner tables. They weren't, unless you couldn't get out of bed, they weren't on separate little trays and things like that. Everybody gathered together. They communed, the true meaning of community, right? They communed, they talked, they interacted, they shared their fears, which of course they all had fears. And, They brought their families in. I mean, look at the beautiful pictures we talked about earlier, with families next to the bedside, whole families. Now, I got to stop there and tell you, this is a really important point. We are talking about an era where when a gay man got AIDS and was dying, the gay man's lifelong partner couldn't come in the hospital room. They would be booted out of the hospital, or certainly out of the hospital room, because they're not family. I guarantee you that never happened at Paternoster. Okay? They could crawl up in the bed and hug and hold and comfort all they wanted. And my mom would have said, good for you, because that's community and that's love. And everything was like that. So one anecdotal funny story that I tell, when I was I believe a senior in high school, well, I had to be because I was about to go to senior prom. I was trying to decide who will I invite to the senior prom. And I was down talking to a bunch of the guys at Pater Noster, sitting around the table, drinking coffee or sodas or something. And, they were cracking up, telling stories and things. And somehow it came out that I had to find a date. Well, interestingly, I suddenly had 4 opportunities for a date because the guys happened to all be homosexual. They're like, hey, pick me. And there was a black gentleman, there was a, white gentleman, it was like the whole mix. And they were just like, if you don't have any trouble finding a date, you just come back here. And one of us will go with you, no problem. And it was just the way they meant it was so loving. It was just that kind of an environment where it's like, we don't want you to stress about this, which if you're, 17, trying to find a prom date, that could be stressful at times, As it turns out, I did know who my prom date was going to be, but it was still awfully wonderful for them to offer that backup plan. But everything was like that. Even the people who often came there and volunteered, if they had the disease, they would stay there when their disease progressed. And it was a family, just like you, at least in the old times, you would expect that in sickness and in health, your family stays with you. That's how this worked. And a great example of that is Peta. Peter worked there for quite a while, amazing volunteer. And then he got sick and he couldn't do as much. And then he got sicker and he couldn't do anything. But he was taken care of by the people who knew him, loved him, his family. And then he died under those circumstances with people surrounding him who weren't sterile in scrubs or white coats, but were his family, his brothers and sisters. And he knew he was loved at death. And that was one of the points my mom always wanted to make sure is no one should die alone, ever. No one, and she doesn't mean like somebody in the room. She means someone willing to hold a hand. And there's a picture with David Kirby that I don't think was published, but my mom usually stayed in the back. But there's I think a beautiful picture of David Kirby with my mom's hand holding his hands, like he has his hands like this, and her hand is on top of his hands, and it's just beautiful, and it is so telling. Regardless of whose hands they are, it's so telling because someone's hands were touching patients and showing them comfort all the time at Pater Noster. And then if they were religious, whatever that religion would be, she would go out of her way to have someone come from that same belief system to help them. Like I said, I mean, there were priests there a lot because she was Roman Catholic, and honestly, the Catholic Church was quite engaged at that point in the more than others. But there were also tons of Methodist ministers, Lutheran ministers, all kinds of people who would visit, volunteer, help out, and especially if that was the request of one of the people there, they would be there. But it was all about meeting the needs of the patient, and it was all about not being like a hospital room. It was about being more like a family bedroom, a family dining room, a gathering place. They would play games. And I think that was the goal, and she achieved it.
So in the early 2000s, your mother's health started to decline, and she had to turn the Paternosters over. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. She knew that this was happening because it was a somewhat slow decline, then more rapid at the end. So before that period, actually, she saw the need growing and that it was going to be a long-term thing, and she knew that she wouldn't be able to do it forever due to her health decline. So she actually reached out to Mother Teresa of Calcutta and the order there of nuns to see would they be interested in taking this over, because she knew that they would run it in a similar way to what she had envisioned it, or maybe even a better way than she had envisioned it. She had amazing love and respect for Mother Teresa. Unfortunately, apparently there's a whole lot of need in the world, and the order gets a bunch of these requests. So she got a very lovely letter back from Mother Teresa and the order saying, please continue your work as long as you can. We are so sorry, but we won't be able to take it over. That was a little disheartening, but she once again said, be not afraid, be not discouraged. So she continued to look for who will be able to continue this. And in the end, she really had no choice. It was pretty much she had to move and had to not keep trying to keep those hours that she was keeping. So she found a group that pretty much promised to keep things as much the same as they could. It was somewhat religious based, and a couple of her volunteers were going to stay on to try to help as well. And she pretty much left the board and turned it over at that point to them. And then tried her best to keep her nose out of their business, which, as you can imagine, is not easy when you've got the passion that she has for this. And moved to Florida, where she helped take care of her own mother until she passed, worked a little bit in nursing homes, and especially dementia units in the nursing homes, and with people that others, didn't really want to take care of. She was always the one who was like, I'll take care of them. That's fine, because that's where the need is. Literally till the day she died, in fact, another act of giving I'll just throw in here at the end is that when she got to the point where medically she couldn't take care of herself, she couldn't even stand long enough to cook and things. She was in the hospital, and I had a private conversation with her and said, Mom, why don't you move home with me? You can, we'll get you a room, your own bathroom, your own space. You don't have to worry about money, all that kind of stuff. And I thought it was going to be a pretty easy thing for her to say, no problem, let's do that. But she pretty quickly said no. And I was surprised, like, oh, well, okay. And then I said, well, what do you want to do? And she goes, well, I think I'm going to stay here and go to nursing home. And it's not often that someone would want to do that. But then I learned very quickly why that was the case. I went out and looked for nursing homes. I'm a physician, so I asked all the hard questions. I got all the ratings. I checked everything as if I were doing an inspection in our department or division. And I made a list of 15 or 20 of the best nursing homes in our area. And the ones at the bottom were definitely not the best. And I gave her the list and I said, I can explain all this to you, which ones were good, which ones have this policy, that policy, what have you, how close they are to the places you like. And she looked at the list and instantly pointed to one almost at the bottom of the list. And I went, well, that one doesn't have that great of ratings. That's like the bottom of the list. I almost didn't even include that page. She goes, yeah, but that's where my brother is. And I need to be with him. He needs someone there, and it doesn't get that many visitors, and he needs me to be there with him. And I remember just thinking, A, she doesn't want to go to a place where she has no expenses, all the food and everything she could ever have, and her grandkids around, because someone is in need, which in this case was her brother. And they were very close. And so that was her decision, was to go there. Now, there was one other part of this, which was it also had less rules regarding smoking. And her big vice was she was a smoker and didn't want to stop that. If she's dying of emphysema, she would say, why stop smoking now? But I think that vice is also why she understood addiction in others. She understood why people have a difficult time giving up IV drug use or what have you, or prescription drug use. She really understood it because she was like, well, if I can't give up smoking after trying too many times to count, why would I expect them to suddenly be able to do more? So she wound up going into the nursing home. And the other miraculous part about this, I will tell you, is that within a week of being in the nursing home, I go down to visit her. I had to go home and I came back down. She is like the center counselor for the entire nursing home. Suddenly, all these people are coming into her room to just chat constantly. I mean, like, if she was awake, there were constantly people coming in to talk with her. If she would go out to the smoking patio, they called, she would be surrounded by people to talk to her and sometimes counseling. And the other interesting thing was there were some individuals at the nursing home who had special problems. They'd had strokes, so they couldn't talk, or they couldn't move their arms, or something that set them apart, or they were mentally ill. And most of the other clients there would avoid them. But my mother never did. Even in the nursing home, she would always be the one to go right over to that person, sit down, start having a conversation, or if they couldn't have a conversation, just hold their hand. And I remember just thinking, the woman just doesn't stop, ever. And that was the end of her life, was that, it just was amazing.
How do you think your mother would want others to reflect on her life?
Well, I think one of the smartest things I ever did was I actually asked my mother that question when she was declining. And I thought I might get a really interesting answer. And so I'll read you some of the things that she said she wanted to be remembered for. I'll try to get through this. Okay. So, by the way, she died March 12th of 2020, and it's still this hard for me to talk about some of these things. It's, you know, just thinking about it is hard. So I basically asked her, how do you want people to reflect on her life? And she said, in quotes, she wasn't very good at financial matters. She never learned to ride a bike or drive on freeways. Her halo was bent, but she spent her life trying to be a normal shadow of our Father's love to her family, her friends, and her patients at Pater Noster House. I asked her what she wanted her loved ones to know, like when she died, when she passed, and her responses were these. I wish to have my family and friends know that I love them. I wish to be forgiven for the times I have hurt my family, friends, and others. I wish to have my family, friends, and others know that I forgive them for when they may have hurt me in my life. I wish for my family and friends to know that I do not fear death itself. I think it is not the end, but a new beginning for me. I wish for all of my family members to make peace with each other before my death if they can. I wish for my family and friends to think about what I was like before I became seriously ill. I want them to remember me in this way after my death. I wish for my family and friends and caregivers to respect my wishes, even if they don't agree with them. That one didn't surprise me. I wish for my family and friends to look at my dying as a time of personal growth for everyone, including me. This will help me live a meaningful life in my final days. I wish for my family and friends to get counseling if they have trouble with my death. I want memories of my life to give them joy and not sorrow. So another thing I'd point out is the obvious. Nearly every response is about someone else. It's just her. Sorry.
Do you think it was your mom's influence in her work that kind of you became a medical professional? Was it her influence, do you think?
Yeah, I'm sure that it was. I think I actually decided I wanted to be a doctor when I was 7 or 8. I drew pictures and said me as a surgeon, me as a doctor, and pretty much, I toyed with other ideas, but I knew that. I think it was her caring personality that I picked up on from early life, and that part of it, I think she definitely was responsible for. I think my dad has some influence in some of those decisions also. I would say, however, that I think my mother was extraordinarily influential in my choice of specialties. So I'm actually a pediatrician, emergency physician, and pediatric emergency physician. And I think especially my absolute love for every child, everything pediatric, and being an advocate for kids, regardless of the consequences to myself, is a direct reflection of my mother. And, there have been times that I think, acted in the way that she would have wanted me to act that really pissed off a lot of administrators. And I'm not sorry for a single one of those times because they were always intended to improve care. And I mean care, not just, an outcome, in other words, a caring outcome for children. And I think that part clearly came from her, and the courage to trust in God that no matter what someone, an employer or a boss or whatever, can do, as long as you're doing what you believe earnestly is God's will, you don't need to worry about that because there's something better coming. And that has shown itself to be true in my life. And I think all of that comes from her and the directions that she pointed me in. My mom would be the first to admit she made lots of mistakes. Her halo was bent, as she says. But I have to be honest, and it's not just because she's my mother. I don't know many families where multiple priests and nuns look to their mother for religious guidance. I've never had a priest ask me for religious guidance, but I can tell you, and I have letters and know of these conversations from conversations with them, that it was a regular occurrence with her. Not that she was brilliant about the Bible or could quote every phrase, but she was actually living it. And that influence, I think, influenced me and influenced many others, Catholic and otherwise, um, because pretty much every organized religion has the same basic principle that you should treat others as, you wish to be treated, or at least more better than you wish to be treated. And that's something that she just always did to a T. And I think, although I'm imperfect by long stretch, trying to emulate that, I'd be a much better person if I could get even close to what she did.